Have you ever scrolled through your social media feed and just paused to like a quote by Rumi? Or maybe you've picked up a greeting card with one of his really beautiful, comforting lines about the universe, or seen his words painted on the wall of a yoga studio.
Oh, yeah, it's almost guaranteed you've encountered him in one of those spaces.
Right. I mean, in the Western world, he is practically the poet laureate of modern spiritual comfort. But what if that quote you shared, that line that made you feel warm and understood, what if it's just a tiny, sanitized crumb of this massive, radical, and practically untranslatable spiritual earthquake?
It's a jarring thought, isn't it?
It really is. And today, we're going into a fascinating source text. It's called The Rumi We Cannot Quote by Max and Claude. Our mission in this deep dive is to basically strip away all that modern bestseller fluff. We want to uncover the real Rumi.
The 13th century Islamic mystic.
Exactly. The guy whose work was never meant to be read passively on a screen. It was actually designed to shatter your ego and be felt physically, vibrating in your bones. Okay, let's unpack this. We hold on to this popular perception of Rumi as this warm, universal, almost grandfatherly guru figure. But the historical reality of who this man was and what he was actually demanding of his students, it completely upends that image.
It absolutely upends it. The Rumi we're going to explore today isn't just a man who sat in a quiet room writing pretty words for our future contemplation. We're looking at a figure whose entire output was the result of a devastating personal rupture.
Right.
And his words were inextricably tied to a very specific, rigorous physical practice. I mean, to really understand Rumi, you have to understand the rigid container he was operating within, and the precise, chaotic moment that container was blown completely apart.
Well, let's build that container, because the pre-poetry Rumi is just a fascinating figure on his own. He was born in 1207 in what is now Afghanistan, and his early life was defined by this profound instability.
Massive instability.
Yeah, his family had to flee Genghis Khan's devastating Mongol invasion. We're talking about a military campaign that was literally erasing entire ancient cities from the map. So you can imagine the psychological toll of that kind of displacement on a young person.
And they eventually settled in Konya.
Right, in modern-day Turkey.
Yeah.
So fast forward to when Rumi is 37 years old. He wasn't a poet at all. He was a formidable, elite Islamic jurist and theologian. I want you to think about your own career trajectory, or a moment when you finally reached the absolute pinnacle of your field. You have the degree, the respect, the students literally hanging on your every word, the secure family life. Rumi had built this impeccable fortress of competence and authority.
He had everything figured out.
Exactly. In the eyes of his culture and probably his own eyes, he was a finished man. There was just nothing left to achieve.
And into that perfectly constructed fortress walks this wandering, ragged mystic named Shams of Tabriz. Shams is the catalyst for everything that follows.
The ultimate disruptor.
Oh, completely. He wasn't a conventional teacher, and he did not care in the slightest about Rumi's vast academic resume or his societal standing. Shams looked at Rumi and saw that this magnificent life was actually just a gilded cage of accomplishment. What's fascinating here is how this confrontation maps onto the Sufi concept of the 3 levels of knowing. The first level is ilm al-yaqin, which is the scholar's knowledge from the outside.
Which is essentially how most of us interact with information today.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like reading a comprehensive, peer-reviewed article about the chemical properties of fire. You can describe the oxidation process perfectly. You can pass a test on it, but you are completely safe from the heat.
That is a perfect modern parallel. You have the data, but no direct experience.
Yeah.
Then you move to the second level, in al-yaqin, which is the knowledge of the mystic who has actually seen the fire with their own eyes.
Yeah.
They've witnessed the heat and the light, so their knowledge is experiential, but they are still maintaining a safe distance. They are the observer. And finally, there is haq al-yaqin, the ultimate truth of certainty. This is the knowledge of the one who has stepped into the fire and been burned. They no longer just observe the flame, they've become the flame.
So Shams basically corners this elite, untouchable scholar and challenges him on the very nature of his reality. He's essentially asking, you preach about the divine every day, but are you just a guy reading a textbook about the fire, or are you willing to actually burn?
Yeah, and Rumi was sitting very comfortably at that second level. He had seen the fire, he was a deeply spiritual man, but he hadn't dissolved his ego into it. Shams didn't bother arguing with Rumi's complex theology. He dismantled Rumi's cage entirely through this raw, undeceived presence.
Just pure attention.
Yes, he offered a quality of attention that saw right through the respected judge to the raw, unfinished, perpetually surprised human being underneath. When you are truly seen that way, all your performative identities just collapse. Rumi had nowhere left to hide his ego.
And the resulting demolition of his life is staggering to read about in the source material. This pillar of the community literally stops teaching. He stops issuing legal opinions. His followers are horrified. They think he's losing his mind. And then Shams disappears.
The historical record is pretty murky on that.
Yeah, he might have been murdered by Rumi's jealous students, or he might have just walked away to complete the teaching. Whatever happened, the sheer crushing weight of that grief is what finally breaks Rumi open. It's an incredible historical detail that Rumi didn't even write poetry before he met Shams.
Never.
But after the loss, the legendary collection, the Divan-e-Shams-e-Tari, it just floods out of him. We're talking about massive, complex, spontaneous verses. He would dictate them while walking through the chaotic, noisy center of the local market, surrounded by merchants and blacksmiths banging on metal. The poetry was literally the residue of a man coming apart at the seams.
And that spontaneous residue is what we are still trying to consume over 700 years later. But Max and Claude make a highly compelling argument in our source text that consuming it in English gives us a fundamentally distorted view of what that residue actually is. The poetry was never composed for solitary reflection and a quiet study. It was a transmission. And the English language fails to capture that transmission on several distinct overlapping levels.
The authors break this untranslatability down so brilliantly. The first barrier is purely cultural. They use the Persian word kazan, which translates to autumn. Now, if you or I read the word autumn in an English poem, we think of a season.
Sure, falling leaves, pumpkin spice, a change in the weather.
Exactly, maybe a feeling of nostalgia. But in classical Persian poetry, kazan carries a deep, built-in cultural theology about the self surrendering its ornaments. The image of the bare branch isn't something sad to be mourned. It is the ultimate state of the self standing naked before the divine, completely without pretense or decoration. Our English translation just flattens that profound spiritual lesson into a weather report.
And that flattening happens on a linguistic level, too. English is inherently a transactional language. It's structured to demand direct statements, clear subjects, and verbs that arrive at a definitive point. Classical Persian poetry operates on an entirely different operating system. It thrives on suggestion. It intentionally circles the subject, offering multiple angles and deliberately holding paradoxes open.
It doesn't want to give you the answer.
No, it does not want to resolve the tension for you. It demands that you sit in the tension and let it work on you.
And that brings us to the experiential level, which completely reframes how I will ever look at a translated poem again. These Persian verses were designed with specific rhythmic structures called radif. They weren't meant to be read silently on a page. They were meant to be sung aloud and felt physically.
Right.
It's like trying to understand the visceral impact of a heavy, pulsating bass line by reading the lyrics on your phone. You're missing the entire physical mechanism. The radif was engineered to vibrate in your chest cavity, to enter your nervous system, and to literally reorganize your state of consciousness while you listened.
And that physical reorganization is absolutely crucial to understanding the metaphors Rumi uses, which are so frequently and tragically misunderstood in the West. Think about how often we see Rumi talking about wine in the tavern.
Oh, constantly.
The default Western assumption is usually either that he was a secular rebel flouting strict Islamic law, or that he was using a clever, safe, poetic code to hide his mystical teachings from conservative authorities.
Right, we naturally assume he's playing a literary game, using a physical object to represent a spiritual concept.
But the source text clarifies that in the Sufi framework, it is not a code at all. The physical world itself is already the metaphor. The material wine you drink from a cup is just a pale, temporary shadow of the ultimate reality, which is divine intoxication. The tavern isn't the literal bar where people go to get drunk. It represents a psychological and spiritual space where the rigid, exhausting rules of your ordinary identity are finally suspended.
It's an equalizer.
Exactly. Inside the tavern, the elite scholar, the wealthy merchant, and the beggar are completely equalized. The boundaries of the ego relax. So when the poetry speaks of Shams pouring wine for Rumi, he was pouring the profound recognition that Rumi was already intoxicated with a divine reality, and he simply needed to stop trying so desperately to maintain his sober, scholarly facade.
That concept of relaxing the ego leads us directly into the central anchoring image of Rumi's epic 25,000-verse masterwork, the Mevlevi. The entire epic begins with the image of the knee, the traditional reed flute. The reed is violently cut from its bed in the river, which represents the trauma of separation from the source. Then it is hollowed out. And the profound paradox he presents is that the flute is only capable of producing beautiful music because it has been made completely empty.
Which is such a powerful framework. If we connect this to the bigger picture of our own lives, it radically challenges how you might view your own internal struggles. Think about the times you feel a deep, unexplainable sense of separation, or that pervasive ache of longing that seems to haunt the modern human condition.
We all feel it.
We do, and the Western psychological mind treats that ache as a malfunction. We view it as a problem to be solved, a void to be filled, or an illness to be cured. But Rumi is suggesting that this longing isn't a mistake at all. The longing is your living relationship to the divine. You only hear the music of the flute because somewhere deep inside your own architecture, the original reed bed is still trembling in recognition.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the tradition moves from brilliant philosophy to demanding reality. Rumi doesn't just leave this as a lovely poetic idea to ponder. He builds a rigorous physical practice around it. In the West, we tend to completely ignore the body in our pursuit of spirituality. We treat the mind as the only vehicle for enlightenment, viewing the flesh as something to transcend or just ignore.
Right, the whole mind-body split.
Exactly. But Rumi's Mevlevi tradition uses the physical body as the primary laboratory for transformation. This is the origin of the sama, the famous whirling of the dervishes. And this isn't just a beautiful dance for tourists. These practitioners spin counterclockwise with intense focus for hours at a time. By doing this, they're deliberately overwhelming the body's vestibular system. The sheer physics of that vigorous, sustained motion clears out the ego's constant chattering background noise. Max and Claude compare the resulting mental space to that hypnagogic state.
That space right before you fall asleep.
Yeah, that strange, floating, boundaryless gap right before you drift off, where your running self-narrative dissolves, but you are still intensely present and aware.
It is a deliberate, methodical clearing of internal space.
Yeah.
And this brings us face to face with a concept that absolutely terrifies the modern Western mind fauna. We love the idea of mindfulness today. We love downloading apps and doing practices that promise to make us 10% less stressed, a little more productive at work, and maybe a bit more patient with our kids.
Spiritual optimization.
Yes. We want spirituality to enhance our current identity. But fauna translates to the total annihilation of the limited self. It actively threatens our carefully constructed identities, our ambitious career goals, and our entire exhausting project of selfhood. Rumi is explicitly inviting you to die before you die, to let the drop of your individual ego dissolve so you can discover the vast ocean beneath it. And that is an inherently terrifying proposition for an ego whose entire existence relies on remaining in control.
It sounds incredibly abstract and intimidating, but the authors ground this ancient concept with a fascinating modern story. They describe a highly successful contemporary psychiatrist living in Istanbul. On the outside, she has all the markers of a modern professional, but secretly she's engaged in muraqabah, which is a rigorous Sufi practice of placing deep, sustained attention on the spiritual art. She maintained this practice for 6 years.
6 years.
Think about that level of commitment. 6 years of sitting in the noise of her own mind, dealing with constant distraction, feeling absolutely nothing mystical, and constantly wondering why she's even wasting her time. And then finally, after thousands of hours, she experienced a brief 3-second opening. Just 3 seconds of an inexplicable radiant warmth and limitless expansion in the center of her chest.
What is truly crucial about her story, however, is the aftermath. The real payoff of those 6 years wasn't about successfully chasing a fleeting 3-second mystical high. It was about the grueling process of training her attention. It was the daily discipline of noticing the noticer. And that fundamental shift profoundly changed the quality of presence she was able to offer her clinical patients. Her patients began to feel seen and heard in a depth they couldn't even articulate, because she was no longer bringing the usual ego-driven analytical processing to their sessions. She was bringing a quality of spacious, unconditioned awareness that allowed her patient's own healing to unfold.
She fundamentally changed her own instrument of perception, which actually perfectly echoes one of Rumi's most famous teaching parables, The Elephant in the Dark Room. Most of us have heard some variation of this story in school or corporate training. A group of people are placed in a pitch-black room with an elephant, an animal they've never encountered. One person touches the trunk and confidently declares that the creature is a water pipe. Another touches the thick leg and argues that no, it's a pillar.
Right, they all fight over their piece of the truth.
Exactly. They fall into a bitter argument because they each only hold a tiny piece. Usually, when we hear this today, the moral we are fed is a very comfortable relativist one. We're told that everyone's perspective is valid, and we just need to listen to each other and combine our viewpoints.
But that is a deeply modern, sanitized reading that misses the actual cut of the blade. This raises an important question about the very limits of human cognition. Rumi isn't giving us a platitude about teamwork and shared perspectives. He is stating that the analytical human mind is structurally, biologically incapable of grasping the whole of reality. You don't need to gather more fragmented information. You don't need to spend more time fumbling around, touching different parts of the elephant in the dark. You need light. You need the illuminating light of direct, unmediated experience. And that light isn't something you acquire from reading more books or debating more perspectives. It is a state of being uncovered from within. You have to stop aggressively grabbing at reality in the dark and allow the room to be lit.
That raises a huge historical question for me. If this tradition is so demanding, so anti-ego, and requires such an intense infrastructure of physical and mental practice, how did it survive the centuries to eventually become the inspirational quotes on our coffee mugs? To answer that, we have to look at the fraught history of the text's survival. In 1925, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk initiated a massive, sweeping modernization and secularization of the newly formed Turkish Republic. As a matter of historical record, these sweeping reforms included laws that explicitly outlawed all Sufi orders. The centuries-old lodges were forcibly closed, and the practice of the sama, the whirling ceremony, was strictly banned. The entire physical and institutional infrastructure of Rumi's lineage was rendered illegal virtually overnight.
But a tradition whose core technology focuses entirely on the interior life inherently knows how to survive external collapse. When the public spaces were shuttered, the practice simply went underground. The physical lodges may have been locked, but the transmission of the teaching did not stop. Max and Claude recount the incredible story of an unnamed woman in Istanbul who had been classically trained in the highly specific music of the ceremony. After the sweeping bans were enacted, she quietly, subversively passed the intricate music and the precise required breath of the knee down to her children and her neighbors. She did this right in her own living room, behind closed doors. The teaching survived the only way it could. Person to person, mouth to ear, a fragile chain of breath maintaining the lineage until the political laws eventually relaxed decades later.
Which brings us to the modern era and the phenomenon of the American Rumi. In 1994, an American poet named Coleman Barks published English versions of Rumi's poetry that exploded into massive runaway bestsellers in the United States. We're talking 500,000 copies sold in a poetry market that usually considers 5,000 copies a major success. Suddenly, Rumi was everywhere, from celebrity endorsements to mass-market paperbacks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of our modern spiritual landscape, Barks's immense success presents a fascinating, almost painful paradox. On one hand, his translations are undeniably beautiful, poetic, and highly accessible. They manage to reach millions of people who are genuinely, deeply hungry for spiritual meaning. But to achieve that massive commercial reach, the translations had to be heavily modified. They largely stripped Rumi of his foundational Islamic context, removing the Quranic references that anchor the original Persian. And perhaps even more critically, they stripped away the grueling, unglamorous requirement of actual practice. Barks's version of Rumi perfectly feeds a modern Western culture that desperately wants the peak experiences of transcendence. We want the overwhelming feeling of divine, unconditional love, but we want it without the heavy demands, the restrictive rules, or the inconvenient community commitments of an organized religion. We want the comforting warmth of the fire, but we completely refuse the risk of being burned.
That is the exact trap, isn't it? We want the profound, easily digestible quotes to validate our feelings, but we absolutely do not want to spin in a room for hours or systematically surrender our egos. The source material is fiercely uncompromising about the role of a genuine teacher in this process. A real teacher in this lineage doesn't hoard your devotion to build a profitable cult of personality or a massive following. They act strictly as a clear lens to redirect your devotion toward the divine. They force you to become more of your true, unadorned self. And as we discussed with the concept of fauna, stepping into that true self feels incredibly dangerous to your ego. A genuine teacher will inevitably ask something of you that your accumulated, successful, performative self simply cannot give.
Because receiving the transmission requires you to first become hollow. If you are entirely full of your own accomplishments, your own refined spiritual pride, or your own modern desire for a quick therapeutic fix, the breath of the divine simply cannot pass through you. There's no room for it. The role of the genuine teacher is to help ruthlessly empty you out, which is inherently a painful, profoundly disorienting process that our culture of constant accumulation actively rebels against.
So, synthesizing all of this historical grit and spiritual demand, what does this actually mean for you, listening to this deep dive right now? Let's solidify the core takeaways. Rumi's original poems were never meant to be passive, easily consumed wisdom designed to make you feel a little better about your stressful day. They were a living transmission. They are a highly specific set of instructions for a rigorous practice of deep, unyielding attention. The space between the whirling that the text constantly circles around isn't some distant mythical location you have to travel to find. It is the vast, silent stillness that already exists directly beneath the constant, exhausting background noise of your daily life. It is the very ground you are standing on right this second, waiting to be acknowledged.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today, building on that resonant image of the cut reed. In our hyper-connected modern world, we all seem to feel this deep, persistent, underlying ache. We immediately pathologize it. We label our feelings of isolation or a chronic lack of fulfillment as a psychological epidemic of loneliness. And because we view it as a disease, we constantly try to cure it. We try to fill that void with more productivity at work, more networking events, more content consumption, more endless scrolling on our screens. But what if that exact painful ache is simply the music of the cut reed? What if, instead of frantically trying to fill your hollowness with the relentless noise and distraction of the world, you simply allowed yourself the terrifying vulnerability of being hollow? What would actually happen if you trusted that the infinite breadth of the universe is already waiting to play profound music through you? If you could just find the courage to stop trying to play the instrument yourself.
That is an incredibly beautiful and frankly terrifying proposition to take into the rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the historical reality of the real Rumi. We encourage you to take a moment today, put the phone down, step away from the screens, sit quietly, attend to the present moment, and just listen to the stillness.